states design and implement drug policies that respect international human rights obligations. We will vote against Amendment L61, and we invite the Member States of the Council to follow suit. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there someone else wishing to speak now? Seems to me not. So at the request of the delegation of Mexico, the Council will now proceed to a recorded vote on L61. So I'm asking the Secretariat to open the voting machine, and I'm asking you to register your votes. Please check if your votes are registered properly and reflected on the screen. And I'm asking the Secretariat to close the voting machine, and the voting is now closed. The results of the recorded votes are as follows: 14 in favor, 20 against, and 13 abstentions. Amendment L61 is therefore rejected. A copy of the results of the votes will shortly be posted on the extranet. And the Council will now proceed to take action on draft text L21 Rep 1 as orally revised and amended. So I will give the floor to members of the Council who wish to make explanations of votes before the vote on draft resolution L22 Rep 1 as orally revised and amended. The first speaker on my list is the United States of America.
The importance of respect for human rights is front and center in the UN Drug Conventions, a foundation of all international drug control policy, as well as in all the declarations and resolutions from the General Assembly and the Commission on Narcotics Drugs. There is no dispute on the role of respect for human rights in drug control efforts. That is why we join consensus on this resolution. While we welcome identification of indigenous medicinal practices as aligning with the International Drug Control Framework, reference to the targets from the 2009 Political Declaration in PP3, which were identified in the last century in the 1998 UN Special Session on Drugs, do not reflect the latest international consensus, including measures adopted in the most recent UNGA Special Session on Drugs in 2016, which this resolution reaffirms in its entirety. The 2009 targets, which were selected to be highlighted by the 1998 UNGA Special Session, were never intended to reflect the full scope of international drug policy. The 2016 policy advocates for a comprehensive and balanced approach that places an equal emphasis on public health and law enforcement aspects of addressing and countering the world drug problem, a policy that appears to focus solely on law enforcement measures to the exclusion of human rights should not be reaffirmed, especially by this Council. In conclusion, I would also like to thank the core group for their very constructive engagement on this process. I thank you.
Thank you. And let me now invite the delegation of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. I deliver this statement on behalf of the GCC countries, namely the Kingdom of Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, the State of Kuwait, the Sultanate of Oman, the State of Qatar, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The GCC countries would like to express their position vis-à-vis the decision entitled Contribution of the Human Rights Council with regard to the human rights implications of drug policy L22. We would like to thank Switzerland for being the main sponsor of this draft resolution. We would like to thank Switzerland for their efforts in bringing opinions closer together. Our countries focus on the policy of countering drugs because this is we would like in this context to highlight the importance of respecting diversity of opinions when it comes to dealing with drugs all over the world. Mr. President, our countries believe that it's important to protect and promote human rights when we are countering drugs. That's why our delegations have contributed constructively in the consultative meetings leading to this resolution. We have expressed our opinions during the consultations where we supported some consensual language in the resolution. However, we also expressed our reservation regarding some paragraphs and terminology in the draft resolution, namely the term in paragraph 17, which is not consensual. Draft resolutions are part of the CND mandate. The CND is the main entity mandated with drug policy in the United Nations. And here I refer to OP 10 and 11. Our group has also submitted an amendment to the L58 with adding a paragraph about the respect of the full sovereignty and regional integrity, independence of the countries and non-interference. Given that our amendments were not taken into account, we as a GCC group of countries would like to distance ourselves from the consensus pertaining to this resolution, and we delivered the present statement in order to clarify our position, and we would like to have our statement archived and documented in the final report of this session. Thank you, Mr. President.
Plurinational state of Bolivia as a floor.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. Bolivia would like to thank the proponents of the L22 document for the presentation of this draft resolution and for the flexibility and the constructive dialogue that we've seen to guarantee respect, protection, and promotion of human rights, dignity and fundamental freedoms for all persons, and to compile policies on drugs must be a priority. We need to adopt a balanced approach, bearing in mind different sectors, in order to provide effective and timely responses whilst guaranteeing well-being of families and vulnerable groups and society as a whole. This is all fundamental in developing responses. This is why we underscore the importance of ancestral practices of indigenous communities in developing traditional medicine and their practices in the field of health. Bolivia is firmly committed to guaranteeing the rights of indigenous peoples and peasant people and Afro-Bolivian people, whilst we also reaffirm our commitment to the treaties to which Bolivia is party. We will continue to try to combat stigmatization surrounding the coca growing. We would recall that as to the relevant convention, Bolivia reserves the right within our territory to uphold the traditional consumption of the coca leaf for cultural and medicinal reasons. This may be used in infusions or grown in necessary quantities for licit purposes. At the same time, we will take all appropriate measures to control the growth of this leaf and illicit production. We have achieved great success in combating drug trafficking thanks to the social control model that has allowed us to adhere to our international commitments. For Bolivia, this is a priority issue and is part of its history and the struggle of its people to rectify historic mistakes and continue in defending the rights of indigenous peoples to use medicinal medicine and have therapeutic use of the sacred coca leaf. We would therefore like to thank the proponents of this resolution once again, and Bolivia will join the consensus and vote in favour. I thank you.
Thank you. And now I'm inviting Luxembourg.
Thank you, Mr. President. The issues put before us in the present draft resolution are of fundamental importance. The text has at its core the willingness to promote human rights in international drug policies and to make a contribution from the Human Rights Council on this matter to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which is the main policy-making body for drug-related matters. We therefore regret amendments that dilute the key principles of human rights. While we deplore the changes made to the text regardless of the constructive and transparent efforts of the core group and the co-sponsors, we consider that these undesirable additions cannot be considered as a precedent. Luxembourg still believes that the resolution before us remains very relevant and of great importance. I thank you.
Thank you, and I'm passing the floor to Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Pakistan reaffirms its commitment in making efforts towards a drugs-free world in accordance with its obligations under international law. Given our geographic location, we face several challenges as a transit country arising from illicit drug cultivation, production, and trafficking. These challenges are compounded by a presence of protracted conflict in the region and its ensuing social, economic, and governance impacts. Despite these difficulties, Pakistan has made significant progress in tackling the narcotics drug problem through a multidisciplinary policy approach which inter alia strengthens rule of law, builds capacity of law enforcement agencies, and reinforces human rights of affected people. Mr. President, we acknowledge the constructive approach and appreciate the core group for taking on board some of our proposals. However, we note that L22 still lacks balance and shies away from 1. Reflecting the issue of world drug problem in the title, 2. Incorporating the aspects in need for adopting a comprehensive, balanced and integrated approach to deal with both the supply and demand sides of the world drug problem, and 3. Weaving in societal and economic damage and impact of narcotic drugs problem affecting the rights of numerous individuals. The text sought to oversimplify the drug-related issues by applying a narrow lens and ignoring positive human rights impacts of law enforcement actions. Such an approach is neither pragmatic nor realistic. A holistic approach instead is required which deals with all dimensions of the world drug problem. Moreover, L22 incorporates references to reports that have overstepped mandates of UNODC which deals with the world drug problem. With regard to operational paras 9 and 10, we hold our reservations on the following basis. 1. It will be burdensome for the OHCHR to start developing technical expertise in an area which is not its core work. Spending resources to develop unwarranted skills undermines the principle of judicious expenditure of resources. 2. There is unnecessary duplication of efforts given that a specialized UN body is already mandated to deal with the world drug problem. Mr. President, we reaffirm the principal role of the CND as the policy-making body of the UN with primary responsibility for drug control matters, and the UNODC as the leading entity of the UN system for addressing and countering the world drug problem. However, considering the importance of the resolution in addressing the world drug problem, we will join consensus. I thank you.
Thank you. And next speaker is China.
Mr. President, the current world drug situation is grave and complex. The international drug control has a long way to go. To strengthen cooperation for win-win results is the inevitable choice by states. China firmly upholds and supports the existing international drug control mechanism based on the 3 major UN conventions and the leading role of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs as the UN drug control policy-making body. In the spirit of the 3 drug conventions and the 2009 political declaration and plan of action, the drug issue should be dealt with by strengthening law enforcement and judicial measures to combat drug-related crimes, taking full account of health and human rights factors, strengthening the treatment and rehab of drug users, and equally emphasizing on supply and demand reduction. The comprehensive, integrated, and balanced principles in the 3 conventions and declaration should continue to be upheld and implemented, without overemphasizing one or various negative factors At the same time, the formulation of various measures should fully respect state sovereignty, giving full consideration to the national conditions and development stage of each country, encouraging feasible practice, and should not copy the views and practices of individual countries and regions to other countries and regions. China has actively joined in the consultation on the draft resolution and would like to thank the sponsors for taking on some of our views. Meanwhile, we believe that the draft resolution needs further consultation. The content is unbalanced, including its failure to fully explain the drug threat and take a comprehensive view of drug issues. And it has included the controversial wordings. In view of the above, China decides to disassociate itself from the consensus on the draft resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me ask the Council if there is another member wishing to make an AOV. Cuba, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. President, Cuba reaffirms its national policy of zero tolerance on the production, consumption and trafficking of drugs. We reiterate our commitment to the international legal framework for drugs control that should continue in keeping with the 3 conventions of the United Nations on drugs, the Drugs Commission of the UN and the Board. We reiterate the leadership and guidance of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and the cooperation across the UN system to tackle the global problem of drugs. President, we recognise the constructive and inclusive spirit of the co-sponsors of the draft resolution. As part of the negotiating process and right to the last moment, we're working hard to cater to different concerns in spite of the diverging views in the approach to the world drug problem. President, the international legal framework for drugs control does not oppose national human rights instruments. On the contrary, it guarantees the social conditions required for the full enjoyment of these rights. Now, although the global world drug problem needs to be addressed from various angles, we do not support politicising the issue by addressing it uniquely as a human rights issue. Therefore, President, to conclude, we reaffirm that the Commission on Drugs is the appropriate body of the United Nations to tackle this important issue. I thank you.
Thank you. Is there another request for the floor? It's not the case, so let me ask you, is there a request for a vote? I see none. I take it that the draft text L22 Ref 1 as orally revised and amended may be adopted without a vote. It is so decided. Thank you. Vietnam.
Thank you, Mr. President. On the amendment L47, our vote appeared as abstention. Indeed, my delegation wishes to put on the record that it was our intention to vote yes on this amendment. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The official records of the session will reflect your statement. However, in accordance with our rules and practice, the results of the vote on L47 will remain as announced earlier. Thank you for your understanding. Colleagues, we will continue with the draft proposal L23 entitled Birth Registration and the Right of Everyone to Recognition Everywhere as a Person Before the Law. So let me ask the delegations of Mexico and Turkey to introduce the text. But before doing that, please let me ask you to be quiet. Colleagues, please, we are already proceeding with further resolution. It's not really polite if you are going to disturb us. If you want to speak, please leave the room. And again, I'm inviting the delegations of Mexico and Turkey to introduce the text.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. I have the honour to present, on behalf of Turkey and Mexico, the draft resolution L23 entitled Birth Registration and the Right of Everyone to Recognition Everywhere as a Person Before the Law. This has been co-sponsored so far by 53 delegations. The draft resolution is a result of the efforts of the core group to find a balance in the opinions of all delegations. We thank them for their active and constructive engagement, as well as the civil society organisations. One of the relevant updates of the text is to highlight the importance not only of birth registration per se, but also on the issuance of birth certificates. This is relevant since there are about 70 million children under the age of 5 who are registered worldwide, but who do not have proof of registration. Without a birth certificate, they face obstacles to the enjoyment of all the human rights and services to which they are entitled. The new draft has also included references to the general principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, including the best interests of the child and the right of children to preserve their identity. Now we would like to give the floor to Turkey to continue the presentation of the resolution. I thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, the draft resolution has a clear objective to advance international standards so that all children are registered immediately after birth without discrimination. Birth certificates are indispensable to uphold individuals' rights and guarantee their access to services. With a birth certificate, children may be protected against statelessness or trafficking, or ensure access to education, health, social security, among others. Mr. President, in a constructive spirit, we made genuine efforts for addressing concerns and reaching consensus. In the same spirit, let me underline that the draft resolution highlights the importance of addressing discriminatory laws and policies that prevent women to register the birth of their children or deny them the ability to pass on their nationality. The Human Rights Council has recognized the importance of birth registration since 2012 by consensus. We therefore look forward to the adoption of this resolution by consensus at this session again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me inform you that there are additional 18 co-sponsors. And now let me give the floor to the members of the Council who wish to make general comments. Finland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I speak on behalf of the EU member states who are members of the Council. This statement has been agreed by the EU as a whole. We would like to thank Mexico and Turkey for once again presenting this important initiative to the Human Rights Council. The EU shares the views of the core group that ensuring timely birth registration and delivery of birth certificates without discrimination is a fundamental right as recognized by Article 24 of the ICCPR and Article 7 of the CRC. Birth registration facilitates access to essential services, provides important data for the planning of such services and ensures that each individual has an official expression of identity. Unfortunately, gender-based discrimination remains a serious barrier to birth registration, passing nationality to children, registering their birth, or changing nationality upon their parents' marriage or its dissolution. Birth certificates are a critical information tool for informing policy and for the provision of important data for the delivery of essential services. We commend the constructive approach of the core group and for their extensive outreach with all states through both informal negotiations and on a bilateral basis. EU member states who are members of the Council were pleased to support this text as initially presented by Mexico and Turkey. However, given the importance of the topic at hand, we will join consensus on the resolution as orally revised. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me ask the Council, is there another member wishing to make a general comment? It's not the case. So let me add that there are PBIs for this draft proposal, and copies of the statement were posted on the extranet. And now let me invite those members of the Council wishing to make explanations of votes before the vote. United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States strongly supports advances in the birth registration text this year on gender equality, as well as its highlighting of gender-based violence and discrimination. Promoting gender equality and preventing and responding to gender-based violence and discrimination are matters of human rights, justice, and fairness. They are strategic imperatives that reduce poverty, promote economic growth, increase access to education, improve health outcomes, advance political stability, and foster democracy. We appreciated the opportunity to engage with the core group on the text. However, we regret that due to differences in views on the meaning and scope of privacy as a human right, states could not agree on how to reference privacy in this resolution. To the extent the term right to privacy is used in this resolution, the United States reads it as specifically referencing the right not to be subjected to arbitrary or unlawful interference with one's privacy, as set forth in Article 17 of the ICCPR. I thank you.
Thank you. Is there another request for the floor? No, it's not the case. Is there a request for a vote? I see none. So, may I take it that the draft proposal L23, as orally revised, may be adopted without a vote? It is so decided. Thank you. The Council will now consider draft proposal L40 entitled Mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the Sale, Sexual Exploitation and Sexual Abuse of Children. Let me give the floor to the representative of Uruguay on behalf of GRULAC and Sweden on behalf of the EU to introduce the text. Uruguay, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. I have the honour to present this Council draft resolution L40 from GRULAC and European Union to renew the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the sale, sexual exploitation and sexual abuse of children. Commercial sexual exploitation of children is one of the most severe human rights violations. It has many root causes supported by historic practices and culturally, and this and we find victims across the world. We're deeply concerned by the persistence of this problem, and the core group of this resolution would ask for the renewal of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur to extend the work and provide annual reports on providing suggestions and recommendations on how to prevent and eradicate all forms of sale, sexual exploitation and sexual abuse of children. The resolution urges all states to adopt effective, urgent measures of prevention, protection, rehabilitation, recovery and reintegration for children who are victims and survivors, as well as to encourage them to set up solid systems to protect children, promoting the full enjoyment of the rights of the child. Our core group undertook a transparent negotiation process with open consultation with states and civil society organisations, and we had a broad bilateral dialogue with all interested parties. We would extend our thanks to all the states of regional groups that decided to co-sponsor our initiative. Finally, we regret that in spite of our efforts, this resolution has been the subject to amendments, including against language that has been previously agreed. These amendments weaken the unity that this Council should convey on such an important issue. We recognise that the negotiations undertaken these last few days allowed us to reduce the number of amendments and to achieve greater consensus. Finally, President, we would encourage all states to support the resolution as a whole and adoption with consensus as we've done in the past. I thank you.
Thank you. Sweden, you have the floor.
No, we stand behind what has just been mentioned by the GRULAC. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been informed that the draft amendment L45 has been withdrawn, and before giving the floor to the Russian Federation to introduce draft amendment L55, I wish to inform the Council that no state member of the Council has yet co-sponsored this draft amendment. In accordance to Rule 69(3) of the ECOSOC Rules of Procedure, which applies to the Council by virtue of General Assembly Resolution 60/251, the Council may take action on a proposed draft amendment by an observer state if there is such a request from at least one member of the Council. If one member of the Council expresses its willingness to consider this draft amendment, we will proceed with it. If there is no such a support, then the draft amendment will not be considered. Therefore, let me ask if there is one member of the Council wishing to proceed with consideration of the draft amendment L55 tabled by Russian Federation. I see no nameplate raised, and then the Council will therefore not take action on draft amendment L55. So let me now turn to the representative of Finland additional co-sponsors. I've been informed by the Secretariat that there are additional 11 co-sponsors to the draft resolution L40 as orally revised. And let me invite those delegations wishing to make general comments to take the floor. Who wants to start? So there's no request for the floor at this point. So let me inform you that indeed there are PBIs for this draft proposal, and copies of the statement were posted on the extranet. And now let me invite those members of the Council wishing to make their explanations of vote before the vote to take the floor. Is there a request for the floor at this point? Is there a request for a vote? I see none. may I take it that the draft proposal L40 as orally revised may be adopted without a vote? It is so decided, and I thank you. And now we will proceed with explanations of vote after the vote on all resolutions adopted under agenda item 3. Is there a request for the floor? Côte d'Ivoire. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. On behalf of the African Group, I would like to make some general observations following the adoption of the resolution on the negative impact of non-repatriation of illicit funds to the country of origin and the impact on human rights and the importance of stepping up international cooperation submitted under item 3 of the agenda. The African Group would like to thank all those who voted in favour of the resolution. We would also like to express sincere thanks to all sponsors and co-sponsors of the resolution, which highlights the great importance of it to everyone. The African Group finds some of the positions of our partners difficult to understand, especially those of the European partners, on this important resolution which is important for our continent and people. We stress that this Council needs to be open to all ideas and concerns, including those of the African Group and those of all regional groups. The non-repatriation of funds of illicit origin to the countries of origin and the impact on enjoyment of human rights is clear. Our countries lose large sums every year due to illicit flows. According to the World Bank, developing countries lose $20 to $40 billion each year due to corruption. In this regard, let me stress that this resolution was submitted to the Council in the same way as it has been since 2011. Considerable efforts have been undertaken, and there is a strong political will shown, which has allowed African countries to have some limited success in recovering the funds. It is more necessary than ever now that we take stock of the difficult economic and financial situation aggravated by the impacts of the health crisis. Even though no new mandate has been created by this resolution, there is a certain unfounded position by some states. We endeavored during informal consultations and bilateral meetings to be as flexible and constructive as possible to address all of the proposals that we received, especially to further bolster human rights aspects regarding the original text adopted in the previous resolution. We therefore remain somewhat disappointed by the position of some partners, which unfortunately reflects a lack of political will to tackle this important issue and to respect the UN Convention Against Corruption. Finally, I would recall that Article 55 of the UN Convention Against Corruption states that the return of assets is a fundamental principle of this convention, and that speedy repatriation of funds to the country of origin is an inviolable and right which is not subject to statute of limitations. And this is necessary to remedy the rights of people whose rights are infringed by corruption. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next delegation on my list is Nepal.
Mr. President, my delegation appreciates the adoption of all resolutions under Agenda Item 3, most of them by consensus. Nepal co-sponsored 8 resolutions, all under the Item 3. My delegation also appreciates the adoption of the resolution on human rights, democracy and the rule of law, agreeing on the pertinent theme for the 5th Democracy Forum as democracy and climate change, focusing on solutions. Climate change is a global challenge and states should commit to accelerating climate action whilst adhering to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. We believe that the upcoming forum would suggest on measures to combating the climate crisis and addressing vulnerabilities while respecting and promoting human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. We are happy to note of the adoption of the resolution on the human rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment after the historic adoption of the resolution by the UNGA recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. We reaffirm that each person should have the right to live in a healthy and clean environment. The consensual adoption of the resolution commemorating 75th anniversary of the UDHR and 30th anniversary of the VDVA reflects states' commitment for the universal promotion and protection of human rights as guided by these milestone documents. Mr. President, states should be accountable not only for the public services delivery as outlined in the SDGs, but also effectively working to secure and preserve the fundamental human rights and dignity of all people in all contexts. The consensual adoption of the resolutions on promotion and protection of human rights and the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and promoting human rights and the Sustainable Development Goals through transparent, accountable, and efficient public service delivery are encouraging towards this end. Mr. President, while we all concur to the fact that human rights are universal, we should strive to reach consensus on the human rights resolution to ensure that all rights are equally respected, promoted, and protected. States should therefore adopt a constructive approach, upholding genuine dialogue and cooperation in their negotiations and avoid politicization of human rights issues. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Maurice.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm taking the floor to provide an explanation on the resolution L15 titled Mental Health and Human Rights. We commend the efforts of the main sponsors and support the overall objectives of this resolution. The government of Maldives strongly believes in the importance of the provision of mental health services to everyone. However, we would like to highlight that the Maldives is not a party to the World Health Organization's Quality Rights Initiative referred in the text, and therefore we disassociate from paragraphs that mention this particular initiative. Furthermore, we would like this explanation to be reflected in the HRC Council report. I thank you.
I thank you. And now I'm inviting United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States is proud to engage robustly at the Human Rights Council to help defend, protect, and promote respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms globally. We support the majority of the resolutions tabled in HRC 52. In particular, we strongly support numerous texts under Agenda Item 3, which promote respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. We would like to take this opportunity to provide important points of clarification related to resolutions adopted under Item 3 and subsequent agenda items. For further points of clarification, we refer you to the full version of our statement, which will be posted on the website of the U.S. Mission in Geneva at the end of the session and included in the digest of U.S. Practice in International Law. We note that HRC resolutions do not change the current state of conventional or customary international law and do not create rights or obligations under international law. The United States understands that any reaffirmation of prior instruments in resolutions applies only to those states that affirmed them initially. The United States supports the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and full implementation of the 2030 Agenda. We note that the 2030 Agenda is a non-binding document that does not create rights or obligations under international law. The right to development does not have an agreed international meaning. Therefore, we continue to oppose references to this as a right. The United States is not a party to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. While the United States, as a signatory, supports policies to advance respect for the economic, social, and cultural rights both domestically and in our foreign policy, the rights contained in the covenant are not justiciable in U.S. courts. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next on my list is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to take this opportunity to set out the United Kingdom's position on resolutions relating to economic, social, and cultural rights. The UK continues to recognise these rights as defined in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and we remain committed to fulfilling our obligations under the Covenant. The UK notes that each state's obligation under the Covenant is to take steps to the maximum of its available resources with a view to progressively realising the full realisation of ESC rights. The UK interprets language in resolutions calling on states to fulfil ESC rights in that light. The UK continues to give effect to the Covenant through a combination of legislation and administrative measures. The Covenant is not, however, incorporated into domestic law, and Article 2 of the Covenant does not require state parties to do so. The UK considers this fulfills the UK's obligations under Article 2, Paragraph 1. The UK also reiterates its position that Article 2 does not require that state parties make ESC rights justiciable. The UK considers international cooperation to be an essential element of its external relations and is fully committed to international cooperation in the variety of its forms. At the same time, the UK stresses that the primary responsibility for the promotion and protection of human rights lies with the state. International cooperation must be viewed in conjunction with the efforts of states and as a support to those efforts. It should neither substitute national efforts in promoting and protecting human rights, nor be a condition for guaranteeing human rights. The UK nonetheless supports resolutions relating to economic, social and cultural rights and is glad to join consensus on these resolutions. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last speaker on my list, at least for the time being, is Chile.
Gracias, señor presidente. Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. Chile voted in favour of Resolution L18 on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures in the enjoyment of human rights presented by Azerbaijan on behalf of the movement of non-aligned countries. We understand that UCMs are a mechanism that it does not come under the principles of the UN Charter and the governing of relationships between states. Chile understands that these measures can have a negative repercussion on the enjoyment of human rights and on free trade and cooperation between states, threatening the achievement of the SDGs. Often, these measures have a disproportionate effect on the most vulnerable groups and can trigger serious humanitarian consequences. President, multilateralism, peaceful dispute settlement and constructive dialogue between states are the guiding principles of the Chilean foreign policy. Under these precepts, our country approves the adoption of this resolution. However, our joining this initiative should not be interpreted as any support to regimes of government or those who are responsible for serious human rights violations which have been subject to UCMs. In this regard, we would like to reiterate our call that the discussion on UCMs and their impact on human rights remain impartial and objective. And we express our categorical rejection for any political use of this resolution. The spirit should be strictly focused on the protection of human rights of the persons who are affected by these UCMs. I thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, we've exhausted my list of speakers and we've finished our deliberations on item 3 resolution. So we will now move to the item 4. And the Council will now consider the draft proposal L3 entitled Situation of Human Rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I would like to give the floor to the representative of Iceland to introduce the draft texts. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to present draft resolution L3 on behalf of the core group of Moldova, North Macedonia, the United Kingdom and Iceland. L3 seeks to renew the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran for another year. The draft resolution is the product of an open and transparent process, and we are grateful for the constructive proposals in the informal consultations which serve to improve the text. The human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran remains dire, with persistent violations of a wide range of civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights. The Iranian authorities continue to violate the human rights of its people and stoke fear through instrumentalizing the death penalty. Impunity for gross violations of human rights and the absence of accountability embolden perpetrators and perpetuate cycles of violence. Continued monitoring, reporting and scrutiny is vital. It can save lives. Mr. President, today's adoption is about solidarity with the people of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It is about demonstrating that the Council stands with all those who wish to simply enjoy their human rights and fundamental freedoms without fear of reprisal or repression. It is about saying stop to the violence and discrimination in law and in practice against women and girls, children, persons belonging to minorities, human rights defenders, lawyers and journalists. Mr. President, I call on all members of the Council to support the resolution today and, if a vote is called, to vote in favour.
Thank you. Let me inform you that there are additional 7 co-sponsors. And now let me invite the members of the Council wishing to make their general comments. Finland, you have the floor.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the EU member states that are members of the Human Rights Council. This general comment has been agreed by the EU as a whole. The European Union firmly supports the renewal of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran and thanks him for his report that sheds light into the deteriorating situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran. We also fully support the inclusion of substantial language in the resolution so it can reflect the extent and the gravity of the human rights violations. We echo the grave concerns raised in the resolution on the violations of the human rights of women and girls. Moreover, we condemn the arbitrary arrests and executions of peaceful protesters, among others. The EU unequivocally opposes the use of the death penalty in all times and circumstances and calls on Iranian authorities to comply with their international obligations deriving from ICCPR. Moreover, the EU urges the Iranian authorities to cooperate with the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission by providing information and facilitating their access to the country. In this vein, we invite all members of the Human Rights Council to join consensus around the text and to support this important resolution. I thank you.
Thank you. The next on my list is Costa Rica.
Gracias. Thank you, President. Costa Rica resolutely supports this draft resolution. My country acknowledges the significant efforts taken by the core group and by the Special Rapporteur with a view to contributing to a solution in step with international human rights standards, in which all persons, particularly women and girls, and human rights defenders may enjoy, in their own country, safety and a life without violence. We regret the lack of cooperation with special procedures and involvement of the concerned delegation in good faith. We hope that the independent fact-finding mission and the rapporteur can count on cooperation on the part of Iran with appropriate resources to conduct their work effectively. This means that discussions and exchanges with civil society organisations should take place freely and without any fear of reprisals. My country trusts that the resolution contributes to combating impunity for serious systematic violations of human rights, forms of generalised discrimination, and that it can lay the foundation of a normative framework based on full equality and the abolition of the death penalty. We reiterate our solidarity with the women and people of Iran and call on member states to vote in favour of this resolution by consensus. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me pass the floor to the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we sit here in the comfort of Geneva under the iconic ceiling of the UN Human Rights Chamber, far from the tragedy unfolding in Iran, we cannot ignore the rising number of reports of what the Iranian people have been suffering in the brutal crackdown that began in September of last year. Mass arrests, sham trials, hasty executions, and lengthy prison sentences being handed down to protesters, as well as the use of sexual violence as a tool to suppress protests. These deeply disturbing actions unfortunately make clear that the situation in Iran continues to require our attention, and the diligent, independent assessment that renewing the mandate of the Special Rapporteur can provide in the form of timely and critical reporting. The deteriorating human rights situation in Iran demands that we take this action today. The resolution before us is the product of collaboration among member states with newly added language to address systematic impunity for gross violations of human rights, including torture and arbitrary arrests and detentions. I'm grateful that after 10 years, the Council recognizes that this resolution must evolve with the current human rights crisis. Despite the devastating consequences of the regime's violent crackdown, members of the Iranian civil society, including defenders such as Sepideh Gholian and Nargiz Mohammadi, among countless others, remain resilient and courageous. The United States will continue to work closely with our allies and partners in the international community to take action to support the people of Iran, who are the victims of these violations and abuses, and to hold perpetrators accountable for their actions. We are proud to join more than 65 co-sponsors and urge all Council members to support this resolution, and we thank the core group for their leadership. I thank you.
Thank you. Now let me ask the Council if there is another member wishing to make a general comment. It's not the case, so we will continue with the country concerned, and I'm passing the floor to the Islamic Republic of Iran. You have the floor.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Mr. President. The draft resolution on which the Council is about to take action, submitted by Iceland and UK as its main sponsors, is totally unwarranted and rejected by Iran. Tabling this resolution is considered by Iran as a malign attempt to deliberately target and destruct Iran's human rights face by producing twisted narratives, negative clichés, and false accusations. This resolution and its mandate deliberately ignores the human rights achievements of the Islamic Republic of Iran and name and shame my country with the aim to divert attentions from the violations of the rights of Iranians and crimes against humanity committed by the sponsors of this resolution through imposing nationwide unilateral coercive measures against my people. Mr. President, weaponization of human rights as a foreign policy tool is unacceptable and endangers the common cause of human rights. This approach neither contributes to the protection and promotion of human rights, nor is it compatible with the realities on the ground and the history and background of the Iranian culture and civilization. Islamic Republic of Iran earnestly believes in the imperative of respect for and promotion of human rights. Our achievements in the field of human rights in the past 4 decades bears testimony to Iran's seriousness towards respecting, protecting, and fulfillment of human rights. In this line, we have continued our cooperation with human rights mechanisms, in particular with the UPR Working Group. We have responded to more than 60% of the communications of the special procedures. We have distributed 35 explanatory reports in Geneva since September 22, on the developments after the death of Ms. Mahsa Amini. We have also established a close contact with the UN High Commissioner Office. But all of these efforts and Iran's achievements are lost among the maximum pressure policy and media manipulation of the sponsors of this resolution. Mr. President, members of the Human Rights Council now are at a sensitive crossroad. They should decide whether to continue to vote in favor of politically motivated resolution or to vote against it to support the Iranian nation in the glory path that they have selected towards independence, dignity, and success. We hope the latter would be the choice today. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now let me inform the Council that there are PBIs for this draft proposal and copies of the statement were posted on the extranet. Now let me invite members of the Council wishing to make explanations of votes before the vote. And let me pass the floor, before passing the floor to Germany, I would like to inform the Council that Germany and Luxembourg have withdrawn co-sponsorship of this draft resolution as reflected in e-delegate and can therefore intervene on this resolution. Germany, you have the floor.
We fully align ourselves with the statement of the European Union and firmly support the renewal of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran. Germany continues to be deeply concerned about the human rights situation in Iran. Consistent and grave human rights violations by the Iranian authorities severely affect Iranians, women and members of minority groups in particular. As restrictions of freedom of information and expression and widespread policy of arbitration detention, torture and other inhumane treatment continue, the need for independent, transparent and impartial reporting in the human rights situation in Iran remains unchanged. We will therefore vote in favour of the resolution and urge other Council members to do the same. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Pakistan reaffirms its support to the mandate of the Human Rights Council to promote universal respect for basic human rights. In achieving this objective, the Council must adhere to the principles of impartiality, objectivity, universality, transparency and non-selectivity as enshrined in the UN General Assembly Resolution 60/251. During negotiations on draft resolution L3, Pakistan re-emphasized the need for dialogue with the country concerned. We also emphasize that the Council's engagement with sovereign states should adhere to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the IB package. Mr. President, originally established in 2011, the mandate has hardly made any contribution to augmenting Iran's efforts and providing technical advice in upholding its human rights obligations. L3 is yet another manifestation of politically driven multiplicity of mandates. The huge financial implications of such mandates undermine the principle of transparency, create conflict of interest, and undercut judicious distribution of resources, especially in times of financial crunch. States bear the primary responsibility to promote and protect basic rights of their citizens. They are best situated to identify and address human rights challenges. The global human rights agenda is best served by consent of and consultation with the concerned country when dealing with affairs which fall exclusively within their sovereign jurisdictions. We are confident that the Islamic Republic of Iran would continue its efforts to promote respect for realization and enjoyment of basic human rights and needs of its people. As L3 does not meet the benchmarks that we have outlined, and the fact that it does not enjoy the consent of country concerned, Pakistan's call for a vote and will vote against it. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Luxembourg.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, President. Luxembourg joins the general comment made on behalf of the European Union. My delegation would like to thank Iceland, North Macedonia, and the UK, and the other sponsors for the resolution before us. We fully support the renewal of the SR's mandate. regarding the human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran for a further year. The severity and extent of human rights violations in Iran, which particularly target women and girls, human rights defenders, and members of minorities, cannot be disputed. The most recent report of the Special Rapporteur clearly shows that the Iranian authorities have used mass arrests and detentions, acts of torture and ill treatment, sexual violence, gender-based violence, arbitrary executions, and the death penalty against protesters. In light of widespread, repeated, and persistent human rights violations in the Islamic Republic of Iran, taking place in a climate of impunity, the mandate of the SR is essential to continue monitoring and documenting violations committed and to contribute towards bringing perpetrators to account. The mandate of the SR is complementary to that of the independent fact-finding mission set up by the Council during its 35th special session in November. The resolution before us further encourages the Special Rapporteur to cooperate with this mission to promote synergies. We repeat our call on Iran to cooperate fully with the Special Rapporteur and to authorize them to visit, and this should be in line with the standing invitation issued by Iran since 2002. Iran must fully respect human rights and the fundamental freedoms of all, in keeping with the ICCPR and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. By adopting Resolution L3, the Council would send a strong message of solidarity to the people of Iran and to all of those who continue to protest for their human rights and fundamental freedoms. Luxembourg invites all members of the Council to vote yes to draft Resolution L3. I thank you.
Thank you. South Africa, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. As a democracy, South Africa owes its very being, in no small measure, to the brave struggles of South African women, many of whom paid the ultimate price so that we could be free. As such, all human rights which encompass the core values of gender equality, empowerment, and the advancement of women take a pride of place in our founding constitution. Accordingly, my delegation takes note of the report of the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Iran and acknowledges the challenges. We would like to encourage Iran to continue its ongoing engagement with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We similarly wish to encourage Iran to enhance its cooperation with the mechanism of the Council, as we urge the Council to pursue avenues for constructive dialogue on human rights with Iran. As such, South Africa is concerned that the draft resolution before us, which should simply focus on the technical renewal of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur, has become mired in geopolitics. In so doing, it may regrettably serve to use human rights to advance other objectives, which could impact negatively on the Council's ability to remain true to its mandate. The wisdom of the High Commissioner at the commencement of this 52nd session is instructive in this regard, and I quote, "The Council has to rise above the fray and use human rights not as a weapon in the context of geopolitical strife, but to overcome our differences through solidarity and genuine dialogue, working across geopolitical divides with a clear vision to advance the needs of every country and the rights of all," close quote. It is for this reason that South Africa will vote to abstain. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite the delegation of China.
Mr. President, China is always opposed to interference in the internal affairs on the pretext of human rights. and to the establishment of country mechanisms by the Council without the consent of the country concerned. We have noted the efforts made by the Iranian government to resolve their relevant domestic issues and the information it has provided. It is our hope that the international community will take an impartial and objective approach to the human rights situation in Iran and respect the path of human rights development chosen by the Iranian people on their own. Draft Resolution L3 ignores the efforts and achievements made by Iranian government, and it ignores the fact that unilateral coercive measures imposed by some countries on Iran have seriously undermined the human rights of Iranian people. Despite strong opposition of the country concerned, the draft resolution insists on renewing the mandate of relevant country mandate, thus interfering in the internal affairs of Iran on the pretext of human rights, which is typical of politicization and double standards. China is seriously concerned that some of the sponsors of the resolution have serious human rights violation problems at home while imposing arbitrary UCMs and carrying out illegal military interventions abroad, interfering in the internal affairs of other countries and seriously violating the human rights of their people. These sponsors should address their own human rights problems, stop unilateral coercive measures and illegal military interventions, instead of using human rights as a political tool to attack other countries. In view of the foregoing, the Chinese delegation will vote against draft resolution L3 and calls on other members of the Council to do the same. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And now let me invite the delegation of Cuba. You have the floor.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. Cuba reiterates its opposition to country-specific items that do not have the consent of the concerned state and that aim to target developing nations, bearing in mind political and geostrategic goals. As we've said in the past, only through constructive dialogue and cooperation can the Council be effective in the promotion and protection of all human rights. If there were truly genuine interest to improve the human rights situation in Iran, it would begin by condemning the UCMs imposed against this country. Their irrefutable impact on the enjoyment of the human rights on the people that are subjected to these measures cannot be ignored. Unfortunately, the draft before us does not mention this issue at all. President, establishing country-specific measures undermines the spirit of cooperation that should dominate this Council, and it only promotes confrontation and interference in the sovereign affairs of the countries concerned. For these reasons, Cuba cannot support draft resolution L3 and will vote against. I thank you.
Thank you. Since I've exhausted my list of speakers, let me ask the Council if there is another request for the floor. At the moment, it's not the case. So at the request of the delegation of Pakistan, the Council will now proceed to a recorded vote on draft proposal L3. I now ask the Secretariat to open the voting machine, and I ask the delegations to register their votes. So please let me ask you if your votes are recorded accurately and reflected on the screen. And if that is the case, I'm asking the Secretariat to close the voting machine, and the voting is now closed. The results of the recorded votes are as follows: 23 in favor, 8 against, 16 abstentions. Draft proposal L3 is therefore adopted. Copies of the results of the votes will shortly be uploaded on the extranet, and we will continue now with the draft proposal L9, entitled Situation of Human Rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And let me pass the floor to Sweden, introducing the text on behalf of the European Union. Sweden, you have the floor.
I have the honor to introduce on behalf of the European Union the draft resolution L9 entitled Situation of Human Rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The EU would like to thank all co-sponsors and delegations for their contributions and for their support. The EU has been at the forefront of bringing the human rights situation in the DPRK to the attention of the Human Rights Council for 19 years. We created the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and established a commission of inquiry. We have led efforts to contribute to accountability for human rights violations, notably through the work of the accountability team of the OHCHR in Seoul. 10 years after the establishment of the Commission and 9 years after its landmark report, we remain deeply concerned by the human rights situation in the DPRK, with ongoing, systematic, widespread and gross human rights violations, some of which may amount to crimes against humanity. Women and girls continue to be at particular risk of human rights violations, as highlighted by the Special Rapporteur. The need for accountability was reflected in the oral update of the High Commissioner. It is our common responsibility to ensure that the appalling human rights situation in the DPRK continues to be addressed decisively. We regret that the DPRK has not followed the recommendations of the previous resolutions. The draft resolution before us aims to address the most pertinent human rights issues in the DPRK. It highlights that the government has tightened restrictions on civil and political rights, ostensibly justifying it as COVID-19 prevention measures, as well as the government's divergence of resources into pursuing nuclear and ballistic missiles over the welfare of its people and their access to food. Furthermore, the draft includes the extension of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur by 1 year and a decision to continue to strengthen, for a period of 2 years, the capacity of the OHCHR, including its field-based structure in Seoul. It requests that the High Commissioner provides an oral update to the Human Rights Council at its 55th session and submits a full report on the implementation of the recommendations to the Human Rights Council at its 58th session. The EU has held one open-ended consultation on the draft resolution and wishes to thank all those who participated in this process, including civil society. We hope that all delegations support the adoption by consensus of this important resolution. I thank you.
Thank you. And let me inform the Council that we have additional 6 co-sponsors. And now I'm inviting the Council members wishing to make general comments. The United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And let me begin by thanking the main sponsors of this initiative for their constructive efforts on what is a critical resolution detailing what is a dire human rights situation in the DPRK. We continue to support the vital mandate of the Special Rapporteur in continuing to shine a spotlight on the systematic and widespread human rights violations by the DPRK. As the latest report from the Office of the High Commissioner has painfully detailed, and in the words of the High Commissioner himself, forced repatriations, state-sponsored abductions and enforced disappearances demand action. Widespread and systematic sexual and gender-based violence must end, which is why we support this text as presented to this Council today. The DPRK must cease diverting resources to its illegal weapons programme and instead prioritise its people's basic economic needs, which are so desperately required. We also urge the DPRK to engage constructively with the international community to address its human rights record and to work to bring about permanent change and improvements for all the people of North Korea. We remind the DPRK that restrictive COVID-19 measures should not be used as a tool to further constrain the freedom of its citizens, nor to restrict the ability of the international community to engage with the authorities in Pyongyang. Mr. President, the UK has co-sponsored the text before us, and we call upon our colleagues here in this Council to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you. And since I don't see another request for the floor at this moment, we will proceed with the country concerned, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The DPRK delegation resolutely denounces the draft resolution on the situation of the human rights in DPRK, submitted by EU at this meeting as a document of political conspiracy which has no relevance with the genuine promotion and protection of human rights. We flatly deny and reject it. The annual adoption of the stereotype human rights resolution against DPRK only proves once again the persistent vicious nature of US and EU attempting to deny and stifle the social system of DPRK under the pretext of human rights. The draft resolution brought up again by EU is no more than plot-ridden document which deserves no consideration at all, as it is stuffed with the lies and fabrications invented to make a living by those human scums who had committed crimes against the homeland and fled, abandoning their own parents and family. The so-called human rights issue claimed by the US and EU can never exist in our social system, where the principle of attaching importance to people and highly regarding them is applied in all fields of state and social life. The priority is given to people-oriented politics in all spheres of state and social life, and the principle of zero tolerance for the slight element and behavior that infringe upon the interest of people is observed by the consistent position of the Workers' Party of Korea and the government of DPRK. However, the US and the EU, as they could not bring us down by force, are making much ado about our human rights issue with a single aim to disgrace the prestige of my country and realize their unrealistic wild dream of overturning our society. The US and sponsors and other co-sponsors of anti-DPRK draft resolution on human rights are the very countries which have been committing human rights violations of all kinds, such as aggression, massacre, destruction, planned and racial discrimination, and have lost even basic qualification and moral integrity, to mention sacred word of human rights. The senior intention to turn the Council into a theater of interference in internal affairs of sovereign state and political confrontation should be duly denounced and rejected. If UNHCR and UN member states are indeed desirous of genuine promotion and protection of human rights, they should raise their voice of justice against the heinous high-handedness and arbitrariness of US and Western countries that indulge in all sorts of crimes against the humanity and act of politicization and double standards in human rights. Mr. President, we remain consistent in our stand to make a positive contribution to the global efforts for promotion and protection of human rights. We will take the toughest countermeasures to the end if the US and its followers dare to infringe upon our social system by provoking us with the human rights, the sovereignty of our state. My delegation strongly denounces once again the documents of political conspiracy tabled by EU as a flagrant violation of dignity and sovereignty of DPRK, and expect that all the representatives would express their stand against it and dissociate from the consensus. I thank you.
Thank you. Now let me inform the Council that there are PBIs for this draft proposal, and all the information will be posted on the extranet. And now let me invite those members of the Council wishing to take the floor and make an explanation of vote before the vote. China.
Mr. President, in recent years, DPRK works hard to improve people's living standard, maintain social equity, develop health and healthcare, protect the rights of children, women, people with disabilities, and has scored positive progress in promoting and protecting human rights. China is concerned about the impact of the situation on the Korean Peninsula on the human rights of the Korean people. The international community should facilitate denuclearization, lasting peace, and sustainable development on the peninsula, and provide the fundamental guarantee for the cause of human rights of DPRK. China urges countries concerned to immediately remove UCM against the DPRK and stop violating the human rights of the Korean people. Mr. President, China always advocates constructive dialogue and cooperation to address differences in the field of human rights. China opposes politicization of human rights, establishing and extending the country-specific mechanism without the consent of countries concerned. Politicizing human rights is not conducive to constructive dialogue and cooperation, to peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. It can only intensify the atmosphere of confrontation in the Council. In view of the above, the Chinese delegation will not join consensus on draft resolution L9. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Cuba.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. President, Cuba is against the imposition of selective and politically motivated resolutions and mandates, such as the case that we have before us against the DPRK. This kind of resolution imposed against the will of the country concerned do not contribute to the protection of human rights, and indeed close the door to dialogue and cooperation which should prevail in this Council. Furthermore, it has demonstrated its inefficiency when it comes to the time and resources of the Council. Respectful cooperation amongst all countries and the basis of the principles of the UN Charter are the appropriate path for the promotion and protection of human rights. A non-discriminatory mechanism, such as the UPR, is the appropriate forum for addressing human rights in all countries on an equal footing. President, the opposition to this selective and politicised mandate does not prejudice any pending issues mentioned in the preambular paragraph 19 in the draft resolution, which requires a fair, honourable solution with the agreement of all the interested parties. Finally, Mr. President, Cuba reiterates that it cannot endorse this draft resolution and therefore does not join the consensus for the draft resolution, and we would like this position to be duly noted. Thank you.
Thank you. And since I don't have another request, Eritrea. I see.
Politically motivated country-specific resolutions and mechanisms on any nation are unacceptable and hence counterproductive. The approach negates the international UN principles and human rights and does not create any dividend in the promotion of human rights, especially when the state concerned is not in agreement. As in another case, this does not emanate from any political alliance, partiality, or abhorrence, and even political stance. The underlying driving force is respect for the ideals of human rights, on which we all have shared and collective responsibility, as well as maintaining the sanctity of the international human rights architecture. Every nation faces its own set of dimensions of human rights challenges. In this context, Eritrea underlines that resort to dignified engagement and international cooperation predicted on partnership, and particularly through the UPR, is the most effective approach. For the above stated reasons, my delegation would like to dissociate from the consensus. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there another member of the Council wishing to speak now? It's not the case, so let me ask the Council if there is a request for a vote. I see none. May I take it that the draft proposal L9 may be adopted without a vote? It is so decided, and I thank you. Now we will continue with the draft proposal L14, entitled Situation of Human Rights in Belarus in the run-up to the 2020 presidential elections and its aftermath. Sweden is going to introduce the text on behalf of the European Union. Sweden, you have the floor.
On behalf of the European Union, I have the honor to present to this Council a draft resolution L14 entitled Situation of Human Rights in Belarus in the run-up to the 2020 presidential election and in its aftermath. We deeply regret that after 2 years since the Council established this resolution, the human rights situation continued to deteriorate in Belarus. The High Commissioner last week spoke about systematic, widespread and gross human rights violations being committed. This confirms the importance of the continued independent monitoring and examination of the ongoing human rights violations in order to contribute to accountability for perpetrators. In the past year, the number of arbitrary detentions and arrests of peaceful protesters reached an unprecedented scale. Belarus currently holds over 1,462 political prisoners, including children, and continues with the mass eradication of independent media and civil society organizations, and with politically motivated repressions. We are shocked by the widespread and systematic excessive use of force, torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment by the Belarusian authorities against peaceful protesters and persons detained. Detainees are deprived of their right to fair trial, instead being sentenced to politically motivated, harsh and lengthy prison terms. We are also concerned about the over 100 documented cases of sexual and gender-based violence against detainees. Consequently, thousands of people have already been forced to flee the country to avoid persecution. To this date, Belarus has completely failed to conduct effective investigations into those violations and to bring justice for victims. Such a lack of independence of judiciary and denial of due process and fair trial guarantees are unacceptable. Belarus' withdrawal from the individual complaints procedure under the optional protocol of the ICCPR has been another blow to justice. Given the scale and severity of the human rights violations committed in Belarus, total lack of accountability, and in the light of another election coming up next year, it is indispensable that the Council continues its scrutiny. We would like to express our gratitude to all delegations that have engaged in the negotiation process and participated in the open, transparent and inclusive consultations conducted on the draft text of the resolution. With this, we call upon all members of this Council to support the adoption of the resolution. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me inform the Council that we have additional 7 co-sponsors. And now I would like to invite those members of the Council wishing to take the floor during the general comments segment. So is there... France, I see you.
Thank you, President. France aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. More than 2 years after the elections of August 2020, Alexander Lukashenko has doubled down by systematically suppressing all criticism of the authorities. The government have recourse inter alia to arbitrary detention, torture, and inhuman and degrading treatment, especially against political prisoners. The increase of their number to more than 1,400 is very worrying. France calls for their immediate and unconditional release. The extent of human rights violations committed by Belarus following the 2020 election deserves ongoing and sustained attention from this Council. This monitoring is ever more necessary given that Belarus has withdrawn from the optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is a new setback for protection of human rights in this country. France reiterates its condemnation of President Lukashenko's complicity in the war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine, which has been ongoing for more than a year. In this context, the recent agreement between Russia and Belarus is a further blow to international peace and security and is a threat to Europe and the world. President France once again commends the courage and resilience of Belarusian citizens who are fighting for respect for fundamental rights and democracy. The dream of a free, democratic, and peaceful Belarus must be heard and fully supported by the member states of this Council. And France, of course, supports the draft resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Ukraine.
Thank you, President. Ukraine thanks the delegation of the European Union for its important work on this resolution and for keeping the human rights situation in Belarus under the scrutiny of this Council. We fully support the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and share the concern regarding the consistent violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms in Belarus and demonstrative impunity for them. We continue to be gravely concerned about the reports of excessive use of force by the law enforcement personnel, arbitrary deprivation of liberty, torture and ill treatment, denial of fair trials, enforced disappearances and forced exile, to name a few. We also condemn the involvement of Belarus in facilitating Russia's military attacks on Ukraine, like the one which is taking place right now as we speak, with the combat jets capable of carrying Kinzhal hypersonic missiles taking off from the Belarusian airfield with the target to kill and destroy. Such a behavior is an insult to the people of Belarus, who do not want to be accomplices to Russia's crime of aggression. In this respect, we wish to specifically commend the authors of this draft for the provision condemning the denial of human rights and fundamental freedoms of those expressing protests or speaking out against Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and Belarusian authorities' support for the aggressor. We continue to stand ready to back all meaningful efforts aimed at facilitating the return of official Minsk to compliance with international law and its human rights obligations, and see the current draft and the work of the Special Rapporteur as crucial element in this process. Therefore, Ukraine strongly supports L14, will vote in favour and calls on all members of the Council to do the same. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite the United Kingdom.
Mr. President, we too remain deeply concerned by the human rights situation in Belarus. Severe repression continues unabated. Civil society and independent media continues to be targeted, with lengthy sentences delivered after closed trials or trials in absentia. The UK strongly condemns the recent sentences handed down to Nobel Peace Prize laureate Ales Bialiatski and Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tsikhanaya, among others, targeted for political purposes. For these reasons, we support the continuation of this mandate. The monitoring and reporting of ongoing human rights violations will one day allow those responsible to be held to account. Continuation of this mandate also signals our support for those brave Belarusians who have consistently shown immense courage in the face of unceasing repression. Let me also thank our EU partners for the inclusive and transparent negotiations held on this draft resolution and for engaging constructively on proposals put forward by other members of this Council. We condemn Belarus's continued use of arbitrary detention and arrests and prolonged detention and welcome the inclusion of language on political prisoners, environmental defenders and women human rights defenders in operative paragraph 3 of the draft before us. We have co-sponsored this draft and we urge our fellow members of this Council to join us in supporting it. Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, I don't register another request for the floor at this point. So let us proceed with the country concerned. Belarus, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. The motives for submitting this draft resolution on Belarus to this Council session, just as was the case 2 years ago, are not at all related to human rights in my country. What lies behind this resolution is the geopolitical interests of some states who have tried to exploit the electoral campaign of 2020 to stir up anti-government protests, to undermine the state, and to interfere in Belarus's internal affairs. This resolution is revenge for the failed color revolution in Belarus, the attempt to use the HRC to justify illegal sanctions against Belarus and its people, and the West's support for extremist and terrorist activities are aimed at destroying the Belarusian state. There is no international treaty that confers the right to interfere in internal affairs of a sovereign state under the pretext of human rights. No one has a copyright on democracy. Outside the Western world, there are states with much more fairness than Western ones. My country has guaranteed all basic human rights: the right to life and security of person, the right to free and accessible education, to medical care, to employment and sickness coverage. The cornerstone of the Belarusian state is maintaining sovereignty and independence, building peace, creating a brighter future and social justice. As President Lukashenko said in an address to the people and to the National Assembly, these are our democratic values and we will uphold them. Belarus respects its international obligations in the area of human rights. We also recognize the importance of international mechanisms for monitoring human rights situations around the world. But these mechanisms must be objective, non-selective, and must strictly comply with the provisions of international agreements. Many governments of initiator and co-sponsor countries are hardly a model for human rights. Without a doubt, the events of recent years in some North American and European countries involving forceful suppression of protests about social and economic policy, the scandals around elections and persecution of opponents, racially motivated crimes, destruction of indigenous peoples, all of these deserve an objective investigation and a bringing to account of perpetrators of human rights violations. Perhaps, for once, justice shall prevail and relevant HRC decisions will be adopted. Unfortunately, against the backdrop of a growing geopolitical crisis and war in Europe, Western countries are actively manipulating the human rights system to push their interests. Pressure has been significantly ramped up on developing countries to compel them to adopt the supposed right side of history and to protect the blossoming garden of the West from the jungle of the rest of the world. Country resolutions against Belarus, as against many other countries, are used as a tool of Western policy. In this paradigm, any UN member state can become a target for pressure and persecution only because an inconvenient leader came to power and there is an independent foreign policy. Belarus rejects draft resolution L14. It does not deal with human rights. This is a weapon in the hybrid war against my country. The provisions within it violate the UN Charter and several key decisions of the UN General Assembly, including on the High Commissioner and the Human Rights Council. We call on Council members to vote against this resolution. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I would like to inform the Council that there are PBIs for the draft proposal and all the information posted on the extranet. And now we will continue with the explanations of the votes before the vote. And I'm asking who has to speak. China.
中国。Mr. President, regrettably, draft resolution L14 is not balanced and impartial in its content. It fails to objectively and fully reflect the efforts and the progress made by the government of Belarus to promote and protect human rights. And ignoring the fact that UCMs imposed by some countries had seriously undermined the human rights of the Belarus people. China urges the countries concerned to immediately lift their UCMs against Belarus and stop violating the human rights of the Belarusian people. In view of the above, and based on China's consistent position on country-specific human rights issues, China requests a vote on draft resolution L14 and will vote against it. We call on all members to vote against it, and we call on the Council to promote constructive dialogue and cooperation to promote human rights. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Cuba, you have the floor.
Gracias, President.
Thank you, President. Cuba reiterates that only through cooperation and constructive dialogue can this Council be effective in its task to promote and protect all human rights. Mandates imposed for geopolitical reasons without the consent of the concerned country are selective, inefficient, and are destined to fail. This is a clear example. The insistence of a resolution against Belarus is a clear example of discriminatory, politicised practices and the double standards that we see in the Council. Every day, it is appearing increasingly to resemble the disappeared Commission on Human Rights. We reiterate our unfailing support to the people and government of Belarus, and we reiterate that establishing country-specific mandates undermines the spirit of cooperation that should prevail here and only promotes confrontation and interference in the sovereign affairs of the states concerned. For these reasons, Cuba cannot support the draft resolution, and as a consequence, we will vote against it. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there another member of the Council wishing to speak and express its AOV? It's not the case, so at the request of the delegation of China, the Council will now proceed to a recorded vote on draft proposal L14, and I ask the Secretariat to open the voting machine. I'm asking the delegations to register their votes. Please check whether your votes are accurately registered and reflected on the screen. And if that is the case, I'm asking the Secretariat to close the voting machine, and the voting is now closed. The results of the recorded votes are as follows: 21 in favor, 5 against, and 21 abstentions. Draft proposal L14 is therefore adopted. Copies of the results of the votes will shortly be uploaded on the extranet. And now let us proceed with the draft proposal L16, entitled Situation of Human Rights in the Syrian Arab Republic. And I would like to invite the delegation of the United Kingdom to introduce the text. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I have the honour to present draft resolution L16 on the human rights situation in the Syrian Arab Republic on behalf of France, Germany, Italy, Jordan, the Netherlands, Qatar, Turkey, the United States and the United Kingdom. Mr. President, the recent earthquakes have had a devastating impact on the Syrian people and will continue to do so for years to come. So we welcome efforts by the UN to ensure humanitarian aid reaches all those affected, and we reiterate our condolences to the victims and the survivors. We are appalled, though not entirely surprised, that the Syrian regime attempted to use the disaster for political gain. These events also did not occur in a vacuum. It is a natural disaster within a man-made tragedy which has unfolded over the last 12 years. The latest Commission of Inquiry report explains clearly how Assad continues to inflict unimaginable pain and acts of violence on his own people. In our resolution, we highlight these persistent violations of human rights and humanitarian law in Syria. Homes, schools, markets, farms, nowhere seems safe from the targeted assault on civilians and their livelihoods. The so-called amnesty laws have yet to result in any further clarity on the tens of thousands of individuals forcibly disappeared and those detained under appalling conditions. Rape and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence are known to be widespread, yet underreported, due to a woeful absence of paths for redress and support for survivors. Mr. President, the resolution we put forward today condemns the continued violence inflicted on the Syrian people, demands that humanitarian aid is unimpeded and that it reaches its intended recipients. It supports the timely implementation of a humanitarian mechanism to clarify the fates of the missing and demands support and justice for victims of sexual and gender-based violence. And it seeks to renew the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry, whose excellent work remains vital for ensuring accountability. So let me thank all of those in this room who have engaged constructively in the informal consultations on this draft resolution. Mr. President, at a time when the Syrian people face devastation anew, it's vital that this Council adopts this resolution to continue our efforts to hold those responsible to account. And if a vote is called on this resolution, I urge our fellow members of this Council to vote in favour of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me inform you that there are additional 7 co-sponsors of this draft proposal, and we are moving to the segment of general comments, and I'm asking the members of the Council who are wishing to make general comments. Finland, you have the floor.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the EU member states that are members of the Human Rights Council. This general comment has been agreed by the EU as a whole. The EU would like to express its support for the resolution on the human rights situation in Syria under consideration today. We also take this opportunity to present our condolences to the Syrian people for the recent deadly earthquakes. We welcome the choice of the core group to present a resolution that focuses on recent developments and on the most egregious ongoing violations. We fully support the resolution's emphasis on accountability and justice, as well as its continued attention to the fate of missing persons. The EU echoes the resolution's calls for a complete, immediate and nationwide ceasefire throughout Syria, and its commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. Finally, we reiterate our full support to the efforts of the UN Special Envoy and reaffirm our full support for the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process in line with Security Council Resolution 2254. A political solution remains absolutely essential in order to substantially improve the human rights situation in Syria. For the above-mentioned reasons, the EU supports Resolution L16 and hopes it will be adopted by consensus. I thank you.
Thank you. And I'm passing the floor to Qatar. Microphone, please. And there is no interpretation.
سيد الرئيس يمر الشعب السوري.
Thank you, President. The brother people of Syria are going through a difficult and very complicated period. Violations of human rights law and IHL are ongoing. Let us not forget that this economic and social situation is deteriorating. There is no settlement to the conflict that has been lasting in 12 years. And Resolution 2254 has not been implemented, which has complicated the situation, as has the earthquake which struck the north of the country. This affected 8.5 million people who were already living in difficult circumstances. This text aims to clarify the fate of disappeared persons in Syria, to find out their whereabouts, and to put an end to this practice, and to ensure the release of all those arbitrarily detained. Also, there is an aim to provide support to families. The resolution also calls for humanitarian assistance to be provided without any hindrance over the entire length of borders, and it is clear how important this aid is. The resolution calls for efforts by this Council and its mechanisms to be supported when it comes to protecting the Syrian people. The resolution calls for putting an end to impunity and ensuring accountability for those responsible for human rights violations. In light of the foregoing, we call on countries to vote in favor of L16 on the human rights situation in the Syrian Arab Republic. We call for proportionality here, as there is great suffering by the Syrian people. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. The human rights situation in Syria is not getting better. The recent earthquakes compounded what were already devastating circumstances on the ground. We talk about fatigue regarding Syria here at the Council. Imagine the fatigue that the brave people of Syria who live with constant human rights violations are experiencing. The Commission of Inquiry continues to provide timely, accurate, and critical reporting on a wide range of violations and abuses taking place in Syria, including those involving aerial bombardments leading to the deaths of Syrian civilians by the Syrian regime and their allies. As such, we strongly support its renewal. The resolution describes some of the horrific effects of the February 2023 earthquakes, a tragedy on top of a catastrophe that has affected millions of Syrians. Despite the enormous challenges, Syrian civil society has yet again shown the world their courage and determination to summon limited resources to save lives. We applaud their efforts. We appreciate the persistent documentation and advocacy by the UN on the fate of the missing and unjustly detained in Syria. The resolution highlights the ongoing reports of torture, unjust detentions, and disappearances, as well as the suffering of family members of victims, including women-headed households. We reiterate the call for the Syrian regime to immediately release all those arbitrarily detained and cease enforced disappearances and the use of torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. We join the co-sponsors in welcoming the UN Secretary General's report on the missing and its finding that measures to address the missing must be coherent, inclusive, and victim-centered. We fully support an enhanced UN effort, including the creation of a mechanism in the General Assembly to address the fate of missing persons, and call on all parties to support it. On the anniversary of the revolution in Syria, we have not forgotten what brought Syrians to the streets to peacefully demonstrate 12 years ago, and the Council should not either. We must show the Syrian survivors that we are aware of the violations and abuses committed in Syria, some tantamount to crimes against humanity and war crimes. We remain committed to supporting the documentation of these violations and abuses, standing in solidarity with the survivors, and promoting accountability. I urge all Council members to join us in supporting this resolution. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite France.
Merci. Thank you, President. President, the human rights situation in Syria remains one of the most serious situations in the world. 12 years since the start of the repression, the Syrian tragedy continues to call upon humanity's conscience to bother all of us and each and every member of this Council. France has been unceasing its efforts to make sure that the human rights situation in Syria remains on the agenda of the international community as a priority. This is why France presents, together with the other sponsors, a resolution to each session of the Council. We will not get used to the situation. We will not resign ourselves to the horror that the Syrian people are living with and have been for years. Without commitment of the regime to a credible political solution, which is inclusive, based on the provisions of Resolution 2254 of the Security Council, there can be no sustainable peace in Syria and no safe, dignified, voluntary return of refugees and displaced persons. For the benefit of the Syrian people, France will remain firm. We will not change our position vis-à-vis the regime until there has been genuine, sustainable progress based on a political solution pursuant to Resolution 2254. Resolution once again renews the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry. It is vital to combat impunity and to fight for justice in Syria. It condemns the deadly violence inflicted on the Syrian people and calls for essential humanitarian aid to be received without any impediments, and to provide information to be provided to those who wish to know the fate of their kith and kin. And the regime must immediately free all persons who they're arbitrarily detaining and to shed light on the fate of those who have disappeared. The earthquake of 6th of February was an additional tragedy for the Syrian people, and France was mobilized to provide relief. But this does not exonerate the regime from complying with its obligations. It does not make us forget the brutality of the regime to its people and the war crimes and the crimes against humanity which it is responsible for. Today, there's some 6 million refugees and a similar number of internally displaced persons. 350,000 people have died. 155,000 persons have been disappeared. Most of them have been through the prisons of the regime. France will keep combating in favour of impunity, and we call upon all member states of the Council to vote in favour of this resolution.
Thank you. Let me ask the Council if there is another member wishing to make a general comment. It's not the case, so we will proceed with the country concerned, and I'm passing the floor to Syria.
Mr. President, once again, we find ourselves facing a unilateral and biased draft resolution that lacks the minimum degree of objectivity, submitted by a group of countries that used to tamper with the foundations regulating the work of the United Nations, and falsely claim, as we just heard, that they are keen on the human rights of the Syrian people. This happens at a time when it became clear to everyone that these countries are alone responsible for the suffering of the Syrian people over the past years, whether by directly supporting armed terrorist groups, the illegal presence of their forces on Syrian territory, direct military attacks against it, or the practice of economic terrorism against the Syrian people. The introduction of this draft resolution distances the Human Rights Council from its primary goal of seeking to realize human rights, and makes the Council a tool to pressure and defame states for purely interventionists' political ends. I will briefly point out some of the serious shortcomings of the draft resolution presented. First, the draft resolution has not obtained the approval of the Syrian government since its submission in 2011. Second, it aims to renew the mandate of the so-called International Commission of Inquiry, whose reports have always been a platform for presenting a biased reading for the situation in Syria and distorting the facts about its context, causes, and results. Third, the draft resolution relies on unacceptable precedents, including bypassing national legal and judicial jurisdiction and promoting non-consensual concepts such as universal jurisdiction. Fourth, deliberately distorting the image of the Syrian government through fabricated allegations without any legal basis. Also, deliberately not referring to the crimes committed by the armed terrorist groups against the Syrian people, which are solely responsible for committing all crimes in Syria. Finally, Mr. President, what the Syrian people request today is not another politicized draft resolution, but rather assistance and to start effective measures to end their suffering. We were looking for the adoption of a draft resolution by this Council demanding, for example, an end to the economic blockade imposed against Syrians. From this standpoint, I call on all member states who are keen on the credibility and independence of the United Nations and on the credibility of human rights mechanisms to vote against this draft resolution and against interference in my country's internal affairs by countries that know human rights only by name. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let me inform the Council that there are PBIs for this draft proposal and all the information were uploaded on the extranet. So now let me ask the delegations wishing to explain their votes before the vote. Cuba, you have the floor.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, sir. Sir, Cuba restates its rejection at any attempt to undermine the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Syria. We reaffirm our commitment.